A tēnā koutou katoa. Hei te iwi whānui ngā rangatira o tēnei rohe. Ka nui te mihi atu kia koutou katoa. He mihi ki te ātua e whakakoro rea tōna ingoa. He mihi ki te kingi Māori atu heitia. Pai mārire kia ia. I ngā mate ngai toa o tātou. Taino ki tō tātou. Rangatira. Whaia Irita Midgley, Glenn Rudd, Rulong Craven, Charles Lloyd, me ngā rangatira o ina whenua katoa. Haere ki te pō, haere ki te rainga, haere ki o tātou tupuna. E ngā hungora, tēnei te mihi kia koutou katoa. Tēnā koe, matua, aku luas ka nui te mihi kia koe mō tō mihi tēnei rā. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I have to start my presentation in Māori, which is our tradition, is our custom. Loosely translated, I acknowledge all of you as leaders in your own respective areas. The first thing we do in Māoridom is we acknowledge God, which I did, and then I acknowledged we have a Māori king back at home, and we pay our respects to him. Then I acknowledge, as we do in our culture, those who have passed on, those beyond moved beyond the veil, especially those recently, and I'm sure you heard those, at least the four I mentioned, as well as we acknowledge others who have moved beyond the veil. And then finally I acknowledge you, the living, we who are here today, to carry on with the loads of life. And so, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, brothers and sisters, it's a privilege for me to be with you this evening. Now, I have to warn you, for us as Māori, we have a tendency to go on. And I've been told I've got 30 minutes, so I'll get a watch out and make sure I don't get carried away. 40 minutes, I'll take the maximum. 40 minutes. Now, I've been asked to come and present to you today, this evening. And actually, before I do, congratulations to the Interpreter Foundation on your successes, on your birthday being 5 years, and all the successes you're having in terms of your reach, people visiting your sites. I suppose if I can add anything to assist from down under, please let me know. But I'm keen to support this work because I know it's a good work. And it's good work for all people, for those of us who are here and those of us who've gone on and those who are coming too. Now, in the Māori world, we have what we call a Māori whakatauki, or proverbs. And we like using these proverbs which help guide us. I've got two I want to share with you right now. The first one is, the path will unfold as we go. So I've got something prepared, but we'll see how we go here, but we'll be good. The second one is this proverb here, and please remember this as we go through our presentation tonight. And it is this, in Māori: E taku mōkai he wā poto noa koe ki wainganui i te wā. Kua hipa ki te wā, kei te tūmai. A loose translation of this proverb is this: we are but a speck in the moment of time, situated between two eternities, the past and the future. As our present is significantly influenced by what our ancestors did, or our past, so our future, or that of our posterity, is significantly influenced by our present, by what we do today. And therefore, although we're just a minute speck in the moment of time and eternity, it's an important time. It's your time and it's our time, and we need to use it wisely. Now with that, that's kind of setting the framework for what I'm going to talk about tonight. And so I've been asked to talk about Māori and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or Māori responses to the church. Now you have to bear with me, ladies and gentlemen, because I'm going to talk to you about Māori culture, the church in New Zealand, and I've only got 40 minutes to do this. Right? And I'm assuming here, excuse my ignorance, but I'm assuming that some of you don't know where New Zealand is, and I have to say from the outset, with respect, no, we're not Australia. That's, as some say, the Western Island. So New Zealand, and so that's an assumption I'm going to make here. Also, talking about this topic in 40 minutes and trying to do it justice is really a challenge. So the way I've decided to tackle this is with pictures. Right? And I've got a bit of text here too. I'm going to hope that you can read it because I'm not going to speak all the text. You can read faster than I can speak. Okay. So if everyone's happy with that, that's going to be my approach. Now when you look at New Zealand, or as we call it in Māori, call it Aotearoa. Right? We're right here. There's Australia. We're right here, down under, as it were. Our population in New Zealand is currently 4.7 million. So it's about the size of population of Oklahoma. We're a British Commonwealth state. We're a unitary state, not a federal state like you. We're an island state too. But in terms of where Māori come from, it's always a great mystery. I have been doing a lot of research on this too. But we come from up in the Eastern Pacific areas. Our oral traditions, our customs, even our language goes up all the way into Hawaii, or the similarities up there, as far as Rapa Nui or Easter Island in the east, Tahiti, French Polynesia. We speak the same language, we have the same customs with some dialectal differences. Right? And so our people hail from this Polynesian triangle. We have relationships there. When we look at the actual country of New Zealand, and this is what I'm saying, I'm going to use a lot of pictures, if you bear with me. I'm going to walk around a bit too, if I may. If I can get this thing working. Okay. Now when we look at New Zealand here, excuse me. My apologies, ladies and gentlemen, I've got a bit of a cold too. Actually, if I mention this before we get into this. So I'm here for 5 months. I'm here with my wife and our 5 children. One's 18, getting ready to go on his mission after this, and our youngest is 4. So this is an interesting adventure for my family. But I'm here as a Fullbright scholar. And I'm on sabbatical. And once I let Uncle Lewis know I'm here, he said, we'll bring you up. It's good to be with you. So New Zealand, So the country of New Zealand. Auckland, if you've heard of it, is up here. That's our main city. Its population is 1 million. Our population, as I said, is 4.7. Hamilton is just south from it, which is where I live, right by the temple in Temple View. My wife and I, my father's from that area. All along this east coast was a strong area for the church in terms of the interaction of Māori in the church, up in the Waikato area and up in the far north and down in the south, southern end of the North Island. Now, so that's a map, what we call a mainstream map of New Zealand. For Māori, we actually turn the country up the other way. Right? That's what we call our traditional Māori worldview. Okay? Now, the reason we do that is because our traditional Māori creation stories, we talk about this demigod hero named Maui. I'm hoping you've seen this movie. If you haven't, I recommend it to you. Now, Maui went around the world, went around trying to improve things and challenging the status quo, as it were. And he also went around fishing up islands. And in the Māori world, we say he fished up New Zealand, and when you look at the North Island, it actually does look like a fish. Right? And we say that's his canoe, that's the fish. But he fished it up, not down, so that's the Māori worldview. What's interesting about that, our Māori worldview is different to what mainstream worldview is. Whether that's right or wrong is academic. What's important here is when we look at different cultures, when we work with different people, it's important to acknowledge difference. To acknowledge they're a different worldview, and it's important we understand, try and understand them. Education is key here. And that was one of the keys with the successes of many of our early missionaries with Māori. So they accepted, okay, these Māori are different, very different from the people up here in the Salt Lake Valley. They do things different here, they have a different language. But the Māori worldview is based around relationships. Right? And to be frank, the Polynesian people, same, based around relationships. The first important relationship with our people traditionally is with the God, with God above. Second is with our past, our ancestors, with our present, our children, and with our future, our grandchildren. Then with our land, our resources, and then we have these collective relationships too, and I'm sure it's some resonance with everyone here. We have these collective relationships as a family, which means we have rights and responsibilities in our families. By the way, in the Māori world, the family is 4 generations. So it's grandparents, parents, children, grandchildren, all the siblings, all the uncles and aunties. That's family in the Māori world. So it can be 100 or more, but I'm sure that's similar to Mormon families here too, right? And then we have our hapu, our sub-tribe, and then our tribe. So we have these collective rights and responsibilities. Traditionally, our legal system was a values-based system, and the values that we treasured are these values here. I haven't got time to go into them in detail, but I'll just say this. One of the key ones is this concept here called mana. And for Māori, the word mana, or the concept, means honour, prestige, or influence. And you're born with this. Everyone's born with it. And in your life, what your soul, what your job is to protect and enhance your mana and that of your group, your family. And so, for example, when you go to school and you do well at school, that's good for you, that's good for your family, and that enhances your mana. If you go and do some terrible things, that diminishes your mana. Right? What's honour? I guess similar to some cultures where they focus a lot on honour in Japanese culture, for example. That's what it is. But in the Māori world, everything was about this term here. So what am I going to do? Is it going to help or hinder our families, our group's mana? But these key values, they determined how people acted, what they did and didn't do. And traditionally, our legal system, we didn't have police, no need for them. People policed themselves based on these values. We were taught what was right, and then you governed ourselves. And when the missionaries came to our people, they had to understand these values. They had to understand that we had rangatira, or leaders. And these words, rangatira in Māori, ra rangatira, means actually one who can weave the group together. That's what a leader is. They can weave the group together. It was traditionally men and women. In fact, I'll be frank here, for many of us, the women are the stronger leaders. I suspect that's similar in some churches, but it's in New Zealand anyway. The men think they're the leaders, but it's actually the women at the back who are helping us to lead along better. It's the precinct, but men and women were the leaders. And again, the missionaries understood this worldview and they worked effectively with them. And so, excuse me if I go through these. The first missionaries, when they came to New Zealand, were the Anglican missionaries in 1814. They were impressed with Māori. A number of Māori went to Australia to trade. Excuse me. And this person here, Samuel Marsden, was impressed by them. Impressed by how intelligent they were, why they were there engaging in trade. And then they invited him back to come and teach them the gospel. So he went and taught them on Christmas Day 1814. Subsequently, a lot of other missionaries went there and had quite amazing success with them. The Mormon church, our missionaries, started in 1854. Now, to be frank, and I'll say this from the outset, the first missionaries did not work with Māori. They worked with the non-Māori population, which is what we call Pākehā. With respect means non-Māori or stranger. So they worked with them first, and then later they worked with Māori in 1881. But Māori were first referred to New Zealand as a place to proselyte, was referred to as early as 1851 and 1853. I'll leave this presentation so you can get it after. And there was a lot of success with, some modest success with the non-Māori population. Just to mention one quick one, there was a Danish jeweler in New Zealand who was baptized. Then he migrated up to Utah here, and he became Brigham Young's jeweler, personal jeweler. And then his daughter was Flora Rasmussen, who subsequently married Ezra Taft Benson. So there were some interesting networks here coming back to New Zealand. Now when we come to the Maori conversions, in 1830, you know that's the year when the church was organised. If you read through your church history, this Joseph Smith, when the angel's referring to Joseph Smith, he refers to Joel 22, 28, Joel 2, 28 and 29, sorry. And you remember the scripture, but that's the scripture in the Old Testament where the Lord says, in the last days, my spirit shall be poured out on all flesh, and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, your old men shall dream dreams, and your young men shall see visions. And in church history, Joseph Smith says that scripture was about to be fulfilled in 1830. At the same time, in 1830 in New Zealand, there was a Māori matakite named Arama Toiro. Te Toiro, a matakite is one who can see into the future. In the Māori world, we have these leaders who are seers for their particular area. And Toiro made a prophecy in 1830. I'll tell you what his prophecy is soon, but subsequently these other matakite made prophecies as well. Pauro Potangoro, King Tāwhiao, Wetiki o Ruruku, and there was a number of others. Now Toiro's prophecy, this is Pauro Potangoro, made a prophecy in 1881 at this marae here, at Te Oreore. This is Hideni and Merewhanga. They were the grandchildren of Arama Toiro. Right? He was. Now Toiro, Hideni Whanga, he was devout Anglican. He was disillusioned with the Anglican Church post-1860. Now, one of the reasons why Māori joined the church, some Mormon critics, they say that the Mormons were opportunistic. They turned up just after the New Zealand Wars, which was approximately 1860 to 1880. And the Māori by this time were defeated, they were discouraged, and that's when they moved in. During those wars too, a lot of Anglican ministers who the Māori trusted, they actually fought with the soldiers. And so as a result of that, the Māori turned their backs on the Anglican Church and some of the other churches. Hideni was an Anglican leader, as I mentioned. He was disillusioned with the Anglican Church, And then in 1884, the American missionaries preached to him in his area. Right? And then 210 were baptized in his area. He was baptized on the 30th of November, 1884. Now, the reason why was because of this prophecy of Arama Toiro. And this is what Toiro said in 1830. By the way, he prophesied a number of other great prophecies too, including the coming of Captain Cook, who was going to die in battles when someone was pregnant, what their child was going to be, what the sex of the child was, as well as what he's going to do in life. But in 1830, he gave this other great prophecy. The setting was as people said, there's so many churches, which one's the right one for us? And this is what Toiro said. There will come to you a true form of worship. It will be brought from the east, even from beyond the heavens. It will be brought across the great ocean, and you'll hear of it coming to Pōneke, it's the Māori name for Wellington. And afterwards, its representatives will come to Te Mahia, where Toiro Hidini Whāngai and his family lived. They will go northward up to Waiapu, but will return to Mahia. Then he says, when this kariki, or this form of worship, is introduced among you, you will know it. For one shall stand and raise both hands to heaven. And when you see the sign, enter into that church. Many of you will then join the church, and afterwards one will go from amongst you, the same way that the ministers came, even to the land afar off. So that's what he said in 1830. That's what was recorded by his people. And this was actually penned down here in Utah in 1902, when Hidini Whāngai actually migrated up here in 1894. Subsequently, in 1902, it was recorded by him. Okay? Now, there's quite a lot of detail on what Toiro said there. Right? You know, they'll come from the east. We go back up there. They'll come from the east, from beyond the heavens, which is where Americans come from. Brought across the great ocean. And then he says, interestingly here, they'll follow a certain path from Wellington all the way up to Mahia, and then they'll go back. And then, interestingly, as he said, their form of worship, he said when they pray, they'll raise both hands. Right? That's what he said. And when you see that sign, that's the right church for you. Right? And then he said, many will join the church. And then one of you has to go back with them. And that was the sanction for Hidini Whāngai to bring his family and migrate up to Utah in 1894, 10 years after his conversion. He brought his family with him. He couldn't even speak English, but he moved up here in faith. Now, that's the reason why I call this a cultural, spiritual conversion. So the response of Māori to the church, as Lewis said, many of the missionaries didn't know what they were doing here. Subsequently, two missionaries, Ira Hinckley and Alma Greenwood, they followed the path that Toiro said. They started in Wellington, then they came up and actually came to the place where the other Māori Matikite prophesied, told all the people there. And actually, that Matikite said a similar thing, but he also said, his one was when they pray, they'll raise their right hand. Right? Now, I'm sure many of you remember this, but for in Mormon church history, when some of our leaders used to pray, they used to raise both hands, right, in public. And when we used to say a number of prayers, such as blessing the sacrament in church, we used to raise the right hand. When we dedicated graves, we raised the right hand, and so on. Well, that is what the missionaries and the mission president at the time, William Thomas Stewart, they came up to this area. William Thomas Stewart preached to the people. Then at the end of it, when he said his prayer, he raised both of his hands. Then the people said they followed the path. That's the sign. This is the church. Okay. So incredibly, for these people in this area, that's one of the reasons why they joined the Mormon church. Right? And again, the Mormon missionaries didn't know what they were doing. Right? Right? They just turned up, preached, had some hard times here and there, but then when they prayed and taught, these were the signs. This was fulfillment of prophecy from a Maori perspective. And to this day, that area is a Mormon stronghold. And these other areas too. So that was in Mahi, which is northern Hawke's Bay. Further south in Wairarapa, there's another Mormon stronghold. When the other places in the Waikato area, the church is strong there. Up in the far north, the church is strong there for various reasons, but these utterances of these matakiti was one of the reasons why. So as I said, it's a cultural response to the Mormon church, cultural spiritual response. How are we doing for time? That's 20 minutes, right? So we're halfway. Now, hold that thought. So there were a number of other great Māori leaders who prophesied of the church. And I have written about this. And I promise I'll get my next one out shortly while I'm on sabbatical. And hopefully for the interpreter. Now, another cultural response to the Mormon church. This one's not well known, but in the Māori world, traditionally, all of the tribes have what we call a whare wānanga. And a whare wānanga is a sacred house of learning. And it's a house, it's a sacred institution where only certain people within the tribe were allowed to go through this institution. It was usually done in a place where it was sacred and not anyone could go into this area. They went through certain rituals, certain processes to enter into this institution. When they were in there, they learnt their genealogy going way back to the gods. They learnt about the creation. They learnt about their relationship with God and what their rights and responsibilities are. They used to enter into this institution. They were washed, and then they go through these processes where they were given new garments, new clothing, and other things as they went through these different steps through a drama too. Now, there's some resonance for that in terms of what the late Hugh Nibley calls patternism, right? Or parallelism, patternism, where there are some similar institutions around the world to the temple. For Māori, myself and another colleague, a lot of the stuff was so esoteric, was so sacred, it was passed on orally, it wasn't written down, and as I said, it was very guarded, sacred. And from about 1865, with the advent of the English and the wars and so on, our people realised that these institutions, our culture is dying, our language is dying, so we need to preserve it, so we need to write it down. In the Wairarapa area, this person here, Te Whatuhoro Juri, he was the scribe for the whare wānanga. So the tohunga, the experts of this institution, they reluctantly agreed to write it down. And then what they said was, we have to build a special building set apart just for that. And then they gave their accounts, and they spoke literally for months about the creation, about the relationship, men and women to God, all these other different things. And he was the scribe for that institution. My thesis here, many of our early Māori converts were part of this institution. Right? Many of them were. In fact, once they joined the church, many of them did what they could to get to the temple, and some of them came up here to go to the temple. When the temple was built in Hawaii, they used to do their best to get to the temple every year. So from 1920 on. But my proposition here is many of our great early Māori converts actually came from this tradition, and they saw the parallels, they saw the similarities, and it had a certain spiritual resonance with them. I have collected a number of these sacred institutions, the writings of them, and hold them sacred, but in the different areas. And we're writing more about this. This is another cultural reason or response to the Mormon church. Again, many of the missionaries didn't know this themselves until they started teaching them about genealogy, doing work for the dead, life beyond the veil, the creation, our relationship to God, the pre-existence, all of those things. It resonated with a lot of our people. And it's saying that's why many of them joined the church too. Now, so there's, and that's what some of these buildings are. Right? The processes, some of them went on, not fully, but some went on in these buildings. And again, many from this tradition joined the church. Now, that's why many of them really sacrificed to come all the way here and to Hawaii to go to the temple and to keep going there. Now, so there's cultural, spiritual reasons or responses to the Mormon church and the missionaries. Briefly, there's these other things that resonated with our people. One of them was intellectual. The importance of education, which is a highlight, one of the key highlights of our church again. The glory of God is intelligence. Similar with Māori, actually, and why we have that sacred house of learning. We embraced education, so much so that Māori were very much more literate than many of the early settlers. Right? And they learnt their literacy and numeracy and other things from the early Anglican and Catholic missionaries by literacy, by reading the Bible. And it got to the point where some of our experts, they said many of the Māori actually understood the Bible better than the Anglican missionaries and the Catholic missionaries because it had a familiar spirit to them. You talk about, when you look at the Old Testament, the book of Isaiah and all that metaphorical language, that's actually the Māori form of language, Polynesian language, the high aristocratic language in those Polynesian cultures. And they understood it, at least for Māori I know anyway, better than the missionaries. Right? But they embraced education, and many of our early missionaries started schools in Māori villages, were some of the first to do that. That's why they embraced the translation of the Book of Mormon, which was in 1889, when the church, the importance of education was emphasised when they established 2 high schools in New Zealand for Māori, the Māori Agricultural College, which went from 1913 to 1931, and then Church College of New Zealand from 1958 to 2009. Right? But that appealed to people, to Māori as well. So there's that intellectual conversion, as it were. So this is where the Book of Mormon was translated in Gisborne, and the people who were involved in that, the missionaries, the mission president and his wife, William Paxman and his wife, and some of the Māori leaders, which included Te Whatahoro Jury, Henare Potai, and these others. That was the Māori Agricultural College. This is President Gordon C. Young and Matthew Cowley as an apostle. In 1948, he called a meeting of all a number of the church leaders who were ex-MAC students, Bridgepa, and at this meeting they passed the motion to start a new high school in New Zealand, which was the seeds of the Church College of New Zealand, which was built by our Labour missionaries along with the temple in New Zealand. And so there was this intellectual response to the missionaries. Another was an economic conversion, as it were. By the end of the 19th century, as a result of wars, diseases, our people were decimated. In 1840, when the Treaty of Waitangi was signed, the Māori population, our estimates are 200,000. By 1900, we were down to 48,000. Right? So our population had diminished significantly, and there was even the view going around that Māori were a dying race. They built a monument in Auckland to the last Māori. So we were dying off as a people. The Mormon missionaries, when they came to our villages, when they came to our people, They helped our people to learn about Relief Society for a woman, learn about welfare, self-reliance, self-sufficiency, to develop all these skills. So I propose to you here there was an economic appeal as well for the missionaries. Right? So we have all these, Relief Society, the canning, preserving that we do in the church. Excuse me. Another response by our people there was the social conversion. Right? When we come to church, as you well know, we're a social organisation too. So we have all these activities for our preschoolers, our primary, our youth, our young adults, those in their sunset years. We cater for all, right? And that appealed to our people as well, the social side of the church, so the social conversion. And that, again, the importance of Relief Society for women. I learnt this on my mission, ladies and gentlemen. I served in Australia. The women love Relief Society. And so does the men, because the women get everything done for us, right? The priest stood for the men, our youth activities. They learnt new skills, the socials. We used to have an annual conference, we call it Huito in New Zealand. It was a huge social institution, cultural and spiritual too. But that started the late 1880s, as I recall. But the social side of it, or the social conversion, that response was important. And so we have a few pictures here highlighting this. The social side, the music, the sports, the conferences. This is in Hawke's Bay, Huito, in front of the marae, and they would go for days. It corresponded with General Conference here in April. And another reason, I say I could go on a bit here, but I'm going to stop soon, in my last 10 minutes. So there was another really important area why Māori joined the church. So we have the spiritual side, the cultural side, the social, the intellectual, the economic. There's also an intercultural exchange that went on. And this is important, if I may mention this. I understand the demography of the church now. There are more members of the church outside of North America than there are inside. And so how are we coping with all the cultural challenges in Latin America, in Asia, in Europe, in Russia, in the Pacific? There's some really important gems here with how the early missionaries worked with Māori and other Polynesians for us to learn some lessons today, I think. One of them, if you look at this quote by Oliver Cowdery Dunford, he served a mission in New Zealand in 1889. In his journal, he said this: "As our mission was to the Maori people, we soon became at home with Maori. We spoke the Maori language. We ate the Maori food. We slept in Maori huts. We slept in Maori beds. We studied Maori traditions. We studied Maori superstitions. In short, as time passed, we began to think like Maori, to feel like Maori, and no doubt look like Maoris. We ate puha, which is a sour thistle, which is really healthy, by the way, and kinas, which are sea urchins, and pipis, which are clams. Like Maori, we enjoyed cooked food in the Maori hangi." Right? That was his calling. I was called to the Maori. So in effect, he integrated into Maori culture, into Maori society, and that intercultural exchange made all the difference for our people. Right? That respect for, yes, we're different. Yes, the food, it may look disgusting, but it doesn't taste too bad when you. It's kinas, by the way. But when you try it, although different, it's good. It's a leap of faith. Right? And so there was this intercultural exchange, right? Another one, Piripi Tamari, one of our great leaders from Wairarapa. He said this is his commentary from a Māori perspective of the missionaries. Sorry, it's a bit long. Should I read it or can you? I'll read it. Okay, he says this: two strange men came to our home. There was something very different about them from our ministers, who are Anglicans, by the way. He says, they came from a strange land, the land of the rising sun, America, and they said, "We are your fellow servants. We are here to do you service. Your equals, not your superiors. Let us eat with you and of what you eat." They had with them a new book, which they explained was the history of my people before they came to this land. These men were very humble and would not accept any of our lands as pay, nor did they meddle with our women. That's what a number of the other missionaries used to do. They actually took a lot of Māori lands. And that was one of the sayings Māori had, was the Anglicans and others said, "You taught us to pray to God. And while we're praying to God, you were down below taking our land." And a lot of the early missionaries did, Anglican missionaries that is. But they said these men, humble, they wouldn't accept our lands, and they didn't meddle with our women, but spent day and night in preaching and teaching us. We soon accepted the gospel and cannot tell you half our joy and how the Holy Spirit was poured out upon us, and to know that we really were the house of Israel. Why, this alone brought us joy unspeakable to our souls. We received that long look for something that we had before lacked. All right. So this is a Māori perspective of the missionaries in terms of that intercultural exchange, that charity, that faith, that humility. And I guess one of the greatest proponents of this approach was Tumaki Matthew Cowley, the Polynesian apostle. His famous slogan, "Kia Ngāwari," which is Alma 7. So you had him, but there are other great missionaries too, such as Oliver Cowdery Dunford, who we mentioned. Incidentally, I was with his great-grandson in Las Vegas before we came to St. George, and we were talking a lot and exchanging a lot. But there are others such as Ephraim Magleby, who's another great leader in New Zealand. Rufus K. Hardy, Robert L. Simpson, Glenn Rudd, Wilfred Smith, Barry Ride, Rulon Smith, and so on and so forth. But they had that intercultural exchange and that respect for each other, and both were transformed in the process. Right? And so the most important for us, though, so we had those cultural, intellectual, educational, economic, intercultural, is the spiritual conversion. Right? The spiritual conversions, side of it where they had that spiritual manifestation. And if we work things right, as you know, that spirit can operate throughout those other areas as well. And so that happened with a lot of our people, which is why their generations are still here today. I come from not as far back as the first converts. Mine go back to 1920, and actually some of my family are in this one here, 1921 Huito. Right? And so, ladies and gentlemen, I know there's a lot more we could go into, but I've got to leave you some time for questions and see how we go there. But I hope this evening has been at least interesting for you in terms of these are some of the Māori responses to the missionaries, to the LDS Church. Right? These are why the church appealed to many of our ancestors, and I add here, these are the reasons why the church still appeals to our people today. And so I'll finish where I started. Remember my whakatauki, my proverb. Taku mōkai he wā poto noa koe ki wangiru te wā, ko hipa ki te wā kei te tūmai. I am but a speck in the moment of time situated between two eternities, the past and the future. Though only a speck in the moment of time, my present significantly influenced by my ancestors, by what they have gifted to us today, and my posterity, what we call our mukapuna, are going to be influenced significantly by what I do today. Right? So there's a right and responsibility for all of us to use our time wisely, and even though we're only a speck in eternity, it's an important speck. And I leave that with you now this evening, in the name of Jesus Christ, amen. Kia ora tata. Questions? So, I'm happy to let you know that was 40 minutes.
Tēnā koe, kia te pēha koe.
Ka pai.
Kia pai.
Me koe.
So one of the things that I learned about the Maori people, I served there from 69 to 71. And what a humble, beautiful people the Maori people are. One thing I learned when I got back was that, remember when the church switched over to the tithing program that they would pay for 100% of buildings? My understanding... it just has to be closer, it kicks off. So my understanding of that was that one of the reasons was a Maori ward in New Zealand that literally it was either 100% or 98% full tithe payers, and yet the income that was produced would never generate anything near what they needed for their share of a building with other gifts. And they were such a faithful people. That was one of the promptings and the decision to say, we got to find a way to help in these countries that are so dedicated and committed. And the Maori people are just a wonderful, committed, humble, dedicated members of the church. And it was an honor to serve with your fellow Maoris. And thanks for this information tonight. It's been wonderful. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Yeah, I remember when I was a little kid, we used to do a lot of the fundraising. We was involved in a lot of fundraising to help build, raise money to help build our chapels and things. And then, of course, our labour missionaries were doing a lot of that work too. Yes.
Well, you could say we got to have. When I was there, they were starting to talk about building a chapel on Queen Street in Auckland. And this was Gordon Young and so on. And what turned out of this was Wendell Mendenhall put together, I hope I have the details straight, put together labor service missionaries, that is mostly Maori young men, came and built the temple, the high school, and 50 chapels. And that meant running quarries, stone quarries, cutting down forests, and all of that. And that went on for years. And if they didn't have the funds to pay, they didn't have the funds to pay for it, but it was their own hands and feet that did that work. And it has made a generation of very devout Latter-day Saints.
Yes, the Labour Missionary Program was an amazing program, actually, inspired of God. But a lot of those Labour missionaries, a lot of our grandparents now were Labour missionaries. And they were called by the local bishop, said, hey, you need to go down to Hamilton. Kind of alluded to it being a weekend, and 2 years later or 3 years later they came back from their labour mission. And interestingly, so they went around New Zealand building in these chapels, but also in Australia. They built over there in other parts of the Pacific too. that whole labour missionary program.
Robert, I wonder if you would comment on the prophecies, the Maori prophecies concerning the building of the temple in Hamilton.
Yes, interestingly, another one of these matakite, Kingi Tāwhiao, actually. He made a number of prophecies again, but one of them was he prophesied of a great building being built on the hill at Tuhi Karamia, which is where the temple is now. He mentioned that. He mentioned a number of other things about the missionaries coming and preaching to our people. So there were actually, there was a specific prophecy of the temple being built in that area. And interestingly, that hill, or just below it where the visitor centre is in New Zealand, was an urupa. When they were, just further down, when they were excavating there, they actually uncovered some human bones. Right? And so there was a number of bones there, and they called up the local Tainui tribe who came in and exhumed the bones and then placed them up in Taupiri, the other sacred urupa, and then they blessed that area so that it would be free and clear for the temple. But in the Māori world, that actually makes the temple even more so a sacred place, a more sacred place, and being the right spot for it there. Yes.
Just a simple question. You said the Maori population was reduced from about 200,000 to 48,000. What is it today?
That's 660,000. And then there's another 150,000 of them across the ditch in Australia too. None of them up here. But in New Zealand, I see it's just 4 million west, 15% population is the official statistics. Yep.
I hope you will indulge me two questions. First, I work in scripture translation. I know there aren't any active translation projects in the Maori language. There are a lot of areas around the world where the area presidencies try to focus on English. I'm wondering if you could comment on how that has helped or hindered the work in that area. And my other question is about a book that was published a few years ago called The Invention of God Among Indigenous Societies, where there's a chapter about Te Whatahoro's role in spreading to Western ethnographers the Maori conceptualization of deity. I wonder if you might comment on how he mediated between the elders' understanding of deity and the West. Thank
yes, the first one, so translation projects. I work with a number of colleagues. One of my colleagues at university is an expert translator, who's recognised, acknowledged as an expert translator in the Māori language. He's not a member of our church, but he does come from an early Māori convert family to the church. And he sometimes gets involved with us in some of the translations, like looking at the Book of Mormon, Doctrine and Covenants, and things. And actually, if you're familiar with Matthew Cowley's account of Matthew Kelly's account of the prophecy in Te Oreore of Paura Potangaroa. In 1881, they had a meeting there. And again, interestingly, the question, among other things, raised was, which is the right church for our people? Political meeting. And some of those Māori meetings, mind you, could go on for 2 weeks or longer. But this one was one of those meetings, and they asked him, he was the great revered rangatira. They asked him, which is the church for our people? He told them to tai hoa, to wait. And they went and fasted for a number of days and prayed. Then he came back and he uttered this prophecy. And Matthew Cowley, this man here, Eriata Nopera, was a young man at the time, at that actual hui, that meeting. And what they did was they recorded what he said, and this is all in Matthew Cowley's works. I'm sure you're familiar with it. But in there, Matthew Cowley says what the local Māori did was they put it in a monument. They called it He Kawenata, the covenant. And they put it in a monument, but before that covenant was put in there, the photographer asked to get a photo of it. He got a photo of it, and then subsequently this man, Iriata Nopera, his family had a copy of that document as a photo, and it was of course in Māori. Subsequently, Iriata Nopera passed it on to Matthew Cowley. Matthew Cowley was amazing at translating Māori, his skill at it. And then what he did was he translated that document, Potangoroa. And interestingly, it's He Kawenata o Paura Potangoroa, the covenant of Paura Potangoroa. At the top of it has the all-seeing eye. And then he goes into his prophecy of the true church. And it's quite detailed, but Matthew Cowley translated it, and then he interpreted it. He said, this is what it means, and it was for our church. Well, that document was subsequently lost, and then a year or so ago, one of Matthew Cowley's great-grandsons was fossicking through their old archives and things in the shed, and he came across a plaque of that prophecy of Paura Potangoroa, and then it was subsequently sent to me. And I went and approached my colleague at the university, who's the expert in Māori translations, and I asked if he could do two things. One is check its authenticity in terms of, is it a 19th century document, in terms of the tone, the language, and everything. And then two, to actually translate it for us, to check the translation. And for those of you who speak other languages, you will know the difficulties of translating across. And anyway, my professor who did this, he said to me, yes, it's an authentic 19th century document, just the whole tone of it, the words, how it's structured, that's from 19th century Māori. And then he translated it, and I gave him a copy of Matthew Cowley's translation. And he said that's a very accurate translation of Matthew Cowley. And unlike Professor Anthony, he said, yes, I'll stick by it and I'll sign something too. But yeah, so there are a number of translation projects going on. In terms of we can talk more after this. In terms of your second one, it's interesting because in terms of Whatuhoro's early work and his experience, there's actually a number of Māori critics, Indigenous critics going around, and they criticise Whatuhoro and others, and implicitly the church, by saying that a lot of this, remember that Sacred House of Learning I mentioned to you? Many critics, academics by the way, are trying to say now that that's not authentic, his works. Right? It's not authentic. It's actually been Christianized. So it's his old Anglican influence and then the Mormon influence implicitly. And so they start refusing to acknowledge his works. And by the way, he had, I think it was about 6 huge volumes of all of this, what went on in the House of Learning. Ethnographers, early ethnographers in New Zealand, they actually took a lot of his information and didn't reference him either. They just went off and took all of his stuff and refused or didn't acknowledge him properly for his contribution there. But Whatuhoro is actually an old Maori leader that in the church we don't fully appreciate. Right? Don't fully appreciate what he did and his amazing work he did. But for me, I'm actually writing about this and trying to, we will be challenging those ones in their views. Right? But that's some of the challenges of these Indigenous academics.
I was really interested in your the conversion experience you shared, where he said that he was taught that he was part of the house of Israel. And I'm interested to see, did this involve to some extent mitigating his own ethnic identity? I mean, did this involve, maybe sidelining some of those earlier traditions, or did they conflate it? Could you please comment on that?
Yes, in terms of this, the whole notion of House of Israel, actually, to be frank, when the Mormon missionaries came to Māori, this wasn't a new concept, wasn't a new idea. The Anglican missionaries, the Catholic missionaries taught similar things. Many of the early archaeologists, many of the early explorers to the Pacific, and even here too, as they understand it, they referred to a lot of the indigenous peoples as being of the House of Israel. And some cynics, academics again mentioned sort of, 1492 with Columbus, their whole lens was, it was the Catholic Church. Right? So everything's the Catholic Church, the worldview is you fit into the Bible paradigm. Okay? And so for the new peoples they discovered, they either came from the line of Shem, Ham or Japheth. Right? And they started categorizing the populations accordingly. And so anthropologists too, it wasn't a new notion, but it appealed a lot to our people. What was different for the Mormon leaders, the Mormon missionaries, was how they linked. Here's the link, and it's the Book of Mormon. And so for many people, it wasn't a compromise of their ethnicity. It actually complemented it. And actually, ladies and gentlemen, I can just refer one back to the other question about whatohoro. Now, whatohoro, so he was the scribe for the Māori whare wānanga. David O. McKay, a number of the mission presidents and other church leaders actually invited him to come up here to the Salt Lake Temple to translate those documents into English. Right? He was invited by the church to do that because many of those early church leaders acknowledged the importance of those sacred manuscripts. Unfortunately, what happened was the New Zealand government stepped in and prohibited him from leaving the country and from those manuscripts leaving the country as well. And I'll say it, actually, the fiend was Maui Pomare, who was a Māori politician. He's the one who's, no, they're not allowed to go, neither of those manuscripts allowed to go. Excuse me. Excuse me. And then what he subsequently did was he went to the church, and the mission president at the time was James Needham Lambert. He had those documents in the base of the church in Auckland, and the New Zealand politician asked him to have a look at those manuscripts. He reluctantly let him have a look, and then the politician refused to give them back. And they were out of the church's hands from that time. Yeah. So some interesting dynamics in politics here. Yes, other questions?
Yes. My question is more cultural. The Maori, historically, did they have a tradition or method of recording important life events, like birth, marriages, or deaths, or are their genealogies more oral history?
Yes, very much so. Everything around a person's life is recorded in one shape or form, but the way our people do it is we're a performative culture, and so our records are in our performances, they're in our carvings, they're in our songs, they're in our dances. We have our genealogy, it's chanted. Right? And so many of our people learn their genealogy and it's chanted all the way back to the gods. So we have these processes for recording everything. And when we look at genealogy, which by the way, the concept of genealogy in the Māori world, the term is what we call whakapapa. Right? And it's a causative prefix, but what it means is, and it's not a swear word, but the causative prefix, whakapapa, but whaka is, it's a causative prefix that enables something to be done. And papa as a flat board, a flat stone. So the whakapapa, or genealogy, loosely translated, is to place and record layer upon layer upon layer upon layer your genealogy into the past and into the future. And it's not only your lineage, but it's all your siblings, it's all of the things you did, the things you were supposed to do too. It's all recorded, and so we have our experts in this particular area as well as experts in others. That's all about recording the stories so that we have things to help us, to instruct us, learning as well as strengthening identity and so on. Yes.
I'm the great-grandson of Ephraim Magleby.
He's a great man. Yeah.
He kept marvelous journals. He was there as a missionary in the 1880s, again at the turn of the century as the mission president, and then came back a second time as mission president during the Depression. Are you familiar with those journals?
Yes. Yes, I am, and I've read them. Actually.
Okay, great. Thank you.
I don't have a private copy of them, though. But I have read them, and I have to say...
Just give me your email. I'll send you the PDF.
Oh, lovely. Thank you. I have to say here too, in New Zealand church history, Ephraim Magleby is not acknowledged enough. He really was one of those great leaders, again, integrated into the community. His journals, he gives a daily account of what was going on in the village. All the different things, the good and the bad too. And I was showing some of the tribes actually where he served. And I said, that's a valuable resource for us. We don't have that. And I said, his is one of a number of the records that the church has of your people. And what your people were doing, what they were like, who the good and the other ones were, and so on. Yeah, but as I said, Matthew Cowley acknowledged him as a great leader, but today, for some reason, we don't acknowledge him enough. I'll say this too, ladies and gentlemen, he was so loved by the people up in the far north that we have these marae. These things here are marae, which is our meeting houses. That's where we used to have church and discuss all the political events and everything. And they're usually named after an ancestor, a prominent ancestor in your lineage that we all connect to. All the people in the far north, when Ephraim Magleby left, they built a marae and named it after him. And as far as I know, that's the only marae in New Zealand, in Māoridom, that's named after an American missionary. That's how revered he was over there. Any other questions?
First of all, thank you for your discussion. This has been very wonderful and informative. This is not my point of view, but I was wondering, and I guess you allude to it a little bit in your discussion, but one of the criticisms that we sometimes hear from certain vocal people, you would know who they were, but I'm not going to mention their names tonight, but is that the church has been a destructive influence on Maori culture. And there's a particular person who blogs on this kind of thing that you're familiar with, but I would wonder if you could address that particular criticism, if you are willing to do so. Thank you.
Yes, okay. You remember I said I'm a lawyer? Well, without prejudice. Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of those early missionaries I was mentioning, that intercultural exchange, that's why they're successful with our people. Right. And those were the mission presidents and the missionaries. And so the mission presidents set the tone, set the policies for basically how the mission runs. And so Matthew Cowley, He was one of the leaders. He said to our Māori people, never lose your culture, never lose your language. Make sure you preserve it and teach it and so on. After him was Reed Halverson and his wife Luana Halverson, who I understand is still alive in St. George, who I'm hoping to visit when I go back, actually. But he was another one who was, maintain your culture and your language. After him, some of the subsequent mission presidents came and reversed that policy, as it were, that trend. And to be frank, there were major ramifications of that shift. It has been a struggle for a number of our people, particularly things like sometimes we go into church and some of the church leaders will say you're not allowed to speak your language in church anymore. You're not allowed to have lessons in Māori, you're not allowed to preach in Māori, and so on. And so it has been a challenge. What the church was doing, however, was they were following mainstream. Those were basically government policies going on post-World War II. But there has now been a renaissance in Māori culture and language and other things. And, the Māori language is an official language in New Zealand with English and American Sign Language, I might add. And so, in church, the policies have shifted again to acknowledge culture, but some of our colleagues do have some heated opinions on that. But I guess for me, our testimony is based on the Saviour and His atonement and faith, the basics of the gospel. We acknowledge, if I may be frank here, sometimes our leaders make decisions that we may not agree with, but my testimony is not based on what that person says or does. And so we just carry on. But I do acknowledge it has been a challenge for all of our people. And hence again, my point, I guess, this is why they were successful, because of that intercultural exchange and that respect and coming into the community. And I would add too is that charity, that faith in charity, where they were with the people. And you remember charity in 1 Corinthians 13, it's not a word, right? It's a concept, and it's a whole chapter in the Bible and parts of the Book of Mormon too, what that means. And kia ngāwari is what that's about too. And as our leaders and our missionaries and our people have that for each other, that makes all the difference. So, sorry, it's a roundabout way of answering your question, but we could talk later about that too.
Thank you very, very much.